Okay, that each time I put a few more of my favorite songs in Hebrew. That was Reichel again, but before that, we had Sid Mechuvan. Thank you so much for joining me today again. I'm pretty excited again, and it's getting colder day by day. So today I'm in a fall jacket, as you would call it. We're going to be talking about something a little more serious than last time, even though last time was a lot of news and politics and stuff. I feel like today is quite a deeper subject, and it's one that's more important to me. So we're going to be dealing a lot with Holocaust survivors. And it's a very hard subject to talk about, especially because I've got a personal connection in this case. And it's not always simple for me. My mother's family comes from Germany, and they were all survivors of places and different camps. So yeah, I hope that I can kind of connect you guys a little more to it and to the situation that Holocaust survivors are living currently in Israel. So right now, I'm going to ask you all to open your Mentimeter again, if you remember. If you remember that website. I'm going to send a link in the chat, and there is a question in that link that you can answer. So the link to vote is in the chat right here. Oh, there we go. Now I sent it to everyone. Now open that link, and we will see the answers right here. Now the question is, which group?
Sorry, excuse me.
Yes,
Mika, excuse me. Could whoever is not muted and has something going on in the background, could you please mute yourselves, because it interrupts the sound from Mika, so I can't really hear her well.
Okay, I just muted everyone, so I hope that works better. So the question is a little problematic. It's, which group in the Israeli society do you think is treated best? And you can base your answer over anything you've heard in the past years about the Israeli society in general. And it can be stereotypical, like Mizrahis or Ashkenazis. You can say Holocaust survivors, you can say LGBTQ+, you can say ultra-Orthodox or Reform, whichever groups you know in the Israeli society that you think are being treated, pretty well. Maybe they have a few bonuses over others. So yeah, you can base your answers on that. And the moment you'll answer through the link, it'll appear right here. So if anyone is having a hard time with the Mentimeter, just tell me or write something in the chat. I've got it open so I can see you. Okay, soldiers, Holocaust survivors, and Orthodox people. Okay, those are pretty interesting answers. Haredim. Okay, we're getting there. You can definitely say Haredim. You can definitely say soldiers. Okay, survivors and LGBTQ. Okay. That's pretty interesting, your answers. And I think that soldiers, it's a funny thing because soldiers aren't treated very well in the army itself, but the society loves them. So it's a very big difference between inside the army and outside of it. Okay, let's wait 1 minute more because we have another question. So don't close your Menti just yet. Okay. So if we're not getting any answers, which is also fine, let's just go over this very, very quickly. I'm guessing that you said Orthodox because until now, there are always Haredim and ultra-Orthodox people in the government, and that made for it very easy, for them to kind of control how much money gets to them. And now it's a little harder. LGBTQs, I wouldn't say because, well, yeah, we still are a very, very religious state in a way, and it's a little harder. And Holocaust survivors we're going to talk about in just 1 minute. But I'm going to ask one of you to explain one of your answers, if that's possible. Anyone who wants to, just open your microphone. You can unmute yourself.
I said soldiers because indeed exactly what you said, Mika, that they're just, it's the value that is placed on soldiers in Israel is very, very high. And it's true, I don't know about treatment. In fact, when I think about treatment and I think about the program that we had been helping with of bringing soldiers here for therapy and healing from their war experiences, they probably don't get enough of what they need. But again, a very high value placed on each Israeli who's serving.
That's definitely true. And I think that the whole country really comes together for the soldiers. And now I'm going to ask you, we're going to move on to the next question. I have two in this Mentimeter. Okay. Why won't it let me do that? Okay. There we go. Next question. It's supposed to appear now. Which group do you think should be treated better in the Israeli society? Of the groups you know.
So Mika, do we use the same link?
Yeah, you can use the same Mentimeter. The same link is supposed to open up this question now. Do you have it? Is it working? Yeah.
Yeah, going there.
Okay, very good. I feel like I've got a good answer for this one. I think Reformed Jews should be treated better in Israel.
That was my answer, but I couldn't figure out how to get it in.
Yeah. Okay, now we had the answer Holocaust survivors on the first question, being treated very well, and now they're on the second question too. So that would be interesting. Whoever put that in, I'd love to hear why you think they should be treated better. Those seeking refugee, definitely. Okay. If anyone wants to come up and explain their answer, I would love that. Yes. Reforming conservative groups. Okay, yes, I see a lot of answers considering obviously the group that we're all from. Reformed Jews and congregations. Yes, okay, definitely. So there's a lot of groups in the Israeli society, and again, a lot of them don't get treated fairly. Now, we're gonna leave this Menti because this is, your answers are definitely correct. All of these answers are answers of groups that should be treated better. And today we're gonna focus on one of them, which is Holocaust survivors. And I mean this, I've seen many Holocaust survivors in my life, and I've been very lucky to, but I know that even if they didn't say anything, many of them were going through a lot of hard stuff that has to do, whether if it's like with mental health or economical issues. And many of the times they don't have anyone to come forward to and talk about with those issues. And I wanted to really ask you, how do you think, in your eyes, from what you've heard or what you think, Holocaust survivors in Israel are treated? Do you know anything about it? What do you hear from Canada?
I would assume that they were treated well because the entire state stops on Yom HaShoah and honors the victims of the Holocaust. So I would assume that they were treated well. I don't know, in fact, what the status is.
Okay. Anyone else? That's definitely a reason to think that they're treated very well in the country. The fact that there's a whole day that is given to them.
I would think also that, I think there are a lot of social support systems in place in Israel for, that have existed over the years for that particular community, who were a large part of the growth of Eretz Israel from 1945 onwards. And being a child of Holocaust survivors and having relatives in Israel, I'm aware that there were many programs to support their mental health. They were given a lot of support. Now, I think the challenges at this stage where the remaining survivors are quite elderly. They're facing challenges if they don't have family, to support them, and the challenges of senior citizens
Mhm.
of dealing with unresolved, the trauma and so on. But I don't know. I would think that I would hope that there would be excellent programs and services existing in Israel for that community.
So this answer is we'll dive deeper into it very soon. And I'm happy to hear that you're very optimistic and you trust Israel as a country to give them all they need. But we'll talk about that a little later. So now we're gonna continue, and I'm gonna ask you, which successful or well-known Holocaust survivors do you know? What comes up to mind? Who comes up to mind when I say think about, one that's worldly well-known, someone that the first person that comes to mind. And if you know their stories, that's even better. If you know who is in these pictures, that would be very cool. Do you?
Is that Eli Wiesel?
Yes, it is. Yeah. Do you know his story?
I just know that he became a writer and wrote stories. One's called Night. I can't remember all of them, but
Yeah.
I remember
Yeah.
reading them as a teenager.
Definitely. And do you know who this one up here is? You for sure know him by name. This is Otto Frank, Anne Frank's father, the one that published her diaries and got them to be, world known. And I don't think there's anyone in the world that hasn't heard the name Anne Frank when you talk about Holocaust. It's very interesting, and I've also went to the museum in Amsterdam, and it was very a very big experience for me. Do you know anyone else? I can think of a little bit of a problematic one. Rowan Polanski was also a Holocaust survivor. He's not one that we want to look to, but yeah, there are a lot of Holocaust survivors that have done well in the world scene.
Dr. Ruth Westheimer.
That's right, absolutely. That's right. And there are also some that did very well in Israel. So I've made a little bit of a list of them. These are all Israeli Holocaust survivors, which means they're not really Israeli, but they've lived in Israel since they came back from Europe. And I want to ask you if you know any one of those names, and if you don't, can you guess who they were? Or still are, some of them.
Menachem
Menachem Begin. You probably know him.
Right, that's the one.
Gila Amagor, she was an actress, right?
Yes.
Marvelous
Yeah,
actress. I remember I can't remember the name of the full name movie. It was something about the tree. I can't remember the full name. She was fabulous. And of course, Chava Alberstein.
Chava Alberstein. She's a very well-known singer.
Yeah. And I've heard of David Elazar, but I don't remember anything about him.
Does anyone know Felix Zanman?
No.
Okay, just a quick thing about him. Without him, none of you would have smartphones.
That's right.
He is the one reason that we have the technology that we have today. He invented, I think, batteries, and the thing that with them, the energy flows. It's something like that. He has a company named Vishay, and he actually invented it while he was in a basement of a house in Poland, hiding from the Nazis. It's a very interesting story. So Gila Almagor, like you said, she's one of the most well-known Israeli actresses ever. She is called the queen of the cinema and the theater. So people love her in Israel. We have Uri Orlev under here. He is a very, very well-known Israeli writer and also a Holocaust survivor. He comes from Poland. And we have Felix Zanman that I just told you about. He's an incredible man. David Elazar was Israel's chief of staff in the army in the Kippur War. And then he was forced to leave actually after that war, for reasons that you probably know. That war was not very successful. And some say that he should have expected what was to happen, and he didn't. So that's why he left at the end of the day, before the end of his term. We have Chava Alberstein. She is an Ashkenazi Jew, born and kind of raised in Poland, then came to Israel and became this very successful writer and singer. She has a song called Ha'omnam, which talks about the experience of the Holocaust in Israel. You know, how Israelis and people that were living here, like in Israel, were experiencing the Holocaust that was happening in Europe. Now, obviously, she didn't write it herself, but she sang it, and it's a wonderful song. Menachem Begin, he was Israel's prime minister for the Likud, very well-known one. Probably everyone in this room knows him, I would like to think. And he was kind of successful in what he did, but at the end of the day, it's a sad story, so we'll talk about him later. And I also wanted to ask you, how many Holocaust survivors do you think live in Israel today? And if you know anything about it, about their situation. Do you have a guess about how many? You can write in the chat, or you can open your microphones and answer. Both are very good.
No idea. Is it hundreds?
More than hundreds, a lot more.
Thousands.
5,000.
Okay, if no one has a guess, then I'll tell you. There are currently 175,000 Holocaust survivors living in Israel. Now, it's not a huge group, but it is a pretty big group in the society. The one problem that Israel has, it's got a lot of problems, but this one problem is that we usually can't hear their voices because most of them don't have many relatives left and don't know how to use technology. And especially during COVID, we can't really hear them. So actually 40 die every day. And the statistics are only getting higher. People that die every day, obviously, they're getting older, and we're losing them every single day. We're losing their memories, and we're losing who they were, and we're left with not a lot. So you would think, as you guys said, that the country would do everything in its power to kind of keep them and make them happy and, you know, make them live in pride in their last years, as you could say, because most of them are nearing 90 and nearing 100. And the oldest one currently is 105. So it's very interesting to know that the situation is not like that. So statistics today show that 51% of Holocaust survivors are living on food stamps and don't have enough of a monthly income to actually buy food on their own. We have 45% saying that they're struggling with paying home expenses, and they go to different places that would give them and help them with that. And, you know, in my opinion, that's not how it's supposed to be. And people are losing, you know, their health, and they're not able to pay for it on their own. They end up, you know, giving up on stuff that they need every day because they don't have too much help. And many times they don't feel comfortable with asking for help, and they don't know who to ask for it from because they're not as connected on social media as we are, and they don't hear and they don't know. And many of the times, you know, especially in times like COVID, when no one was leaving their house, no one really cared. So 25% are not in contact with any family that leaves them on their own. And these are all statistics that I did not, you know, this is not something I invented. I researched this online, and these are really, really bad statistics, in my opinion. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think they're treated in Canada? Is there anything that Canada does or gives to Holocaust survivors here? Do you think it's any different?
Well, I think we constantly hear about the UJA reaching out for support for Holocaust survivors and being able to raise funds in order to support them and actively go into the community. But I would think it's similar here, where many are may have lost family or don't have the resources to take care of themselves and require help.
Mhm. Yes. So someone said in the chat, I noticed a sign being held up saying, remember the living. So this was actually at a protest for, like to give more support for Holocaust survivors. So it says, ניצולי השואה רוצים לחיות בכבוד וברווחה, which means the Holocaust survivors want to live, with respect and with the ability to live their lives as they want to without having to worry about issues like this. But I just want to ask you if you don't think it's crazy that they even do. Does anyone else want to say? Oh, Karen, I think you're muted.
I was just going to say, of course it is.
Yeah, it's a very, very hard situation. And does anyone else have an answer about Canada, about how Holocaust survivors are living here?
I think the sad thing is that when you don't have someone to advocate for you, and if they don't have contact with family or friends to support them, it's very difficult for anyone, Holocaust survivors or anyone in need, to sometimes advocate for themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So I would assume, I don't know. I know that the Kosher Food Bank is always looking. I know that, as Shelley was saying, that the UJA is always looking for ways to support the survivors that we're aware of, that are out there that need support. But I don't know how much support they're getting.
Okay, definitely. I agree with that. And I will also add and say that there are definitely people that are trying to help them, whether in Israel or outside of it, but not always can we reach out to all of them, because some of them just don't know how to use technology. Some of them just don't know how to ask for help. And we need to remember that many of them are handling PTSD and just don't want to ask for that help because they want to feel independent and like this is their own lives. So we're going to watch this short video. This is about a woman that is a Holocaust survivor in Israel, and she talks about the state that she's living in. And I hope I did. Yeah, okay. So it's sharing the sound. What's this? Okay. Well, let's hear her story.
אני נולדתי בפולין. אז היה פולין בגבול עם רוסיה קרוב.
Raya was 6 years old when World War II began in 1939. A year later, she and her family were among tens of thousands of Jews the Nazis forced into the ghetto in the Polish city of Lodz.
תקופה קצרה, הגרמנים ראו שיותר מדי טוב לנו, עשו מהמקום איפה שהיינו חצי, ואנשים התחילו לקבל כל מיני מחלות, טיפוס, דיזנטריה.
Raya's father understood it was an emergency. He escaped. Once outside, he paid a bribe to have his family released. He then found a Christian family who agreed to take in one child, Raya, saving her life.
באמצע לילה באו, הציעו את אבא, אמא, ואת האח הקטן, פרקו אותם.
There was no one to pay to hide the little girl anymore. Raya was just 8 years old, alone and hunted. She would survive for 2 years by herself. First in a pigsty and then in the forest.
והיא שואלת אותי, למה אני גונבת? אז אני מספרת לה את הסיפור כמו כל הזמן. לאוקראינים סיפרתי שהפולנים הרגו את ההורים ואני מפחדת, אין לי הפחד. והיא מסתכלת ושואלת אותי, את לא יודעת שאין כבר מלחמה? אני לא ידעתי.
In 1957, aged 24, Raya migrated to Israel. She went to register as a Holocaust survivor so she could receive compensation.
מה שהיה מגיע לי, לא קיבלתי. אלה שבאו מוקדם, כל הזכויות יש להם. בגלל שאני לא הגעתי בזמן, אני לא קיבלתי כלום.
In Israel, Jews who survived the Nazis do not all receive equal treatment. Survivors who migrated before 1953 receive a monthly allowance from 500 to 2,500 euros. Those who arrived after 1953 receive less than 1,000 euros per year, and that's only a recent reform.
כשעושים לי תמונה, נו חיוך, אני לא יודעת, אני יודעת לבכות.
לא.
אני מקווה שתחייכי היום.
Thanks to 2 Israeli charities and 1 French one, Raya and 100 other survivors will receive free hearing aids.
So sadly, that's the situation currently in Israel, where we have people. Were you aware of the fact that people that came to Israel after 1953 do not receive the same pay? So I will tell you about this. This was an agreement made between Germany and Israel after the war had ended. So in the agreement, what was decided was that Jews that came to Israel after the war from Europe following the war, but until the agreement was signed in 1952, will receive higher pay, okay, and higher monthly allowances than anyone that came later. So they took responsibility for those who came to Israel right after, but they said, if anyone has stayed in Germany or in Europe in general until now, then they'll only come to Israel to get the money. So we're not going to give them as much. That was the base of the agreement. So what had happened and what is happening today is that we actually see that on the paper with Jews and Holocaust survivors that came after 1953 to the country, which is a lot. There is a lot of Jews that could not come before for obvious reasons. There were wars going on and some of them were stuck in Russia after they had escaped. There was a lot going on, but those Jews are not receiving the same treatment. And many of them are the ones that are living under the poverty lines. And some say that that also has to do with a certain mentality that we'll talk about in a minute. So you will probably want to ask, why is the country allowing that to go on? Why are they not changing something? Why are they not giving them, what they deserve? And to be honest, I don't have an answer for that. But I can tell you some other stuff that is going on. So some people say that the fact that some of the Holocaust survivors are living in poverty is that they don't work for too many years because they have different problems, because they're stuck in the past. So there's this thing in Israel, it's called the mentality of going back and looking back versus looking forward, which means, are you going to stay stuck in the past and think about your memories and, keep on replaying that same story in your head? Or are you going to be looking forward like Gilal Magor or David Elazar and say, I'm going to start a new life? So people believe that some of the people that live in poverty, the Holocaust survivors, are stuck there because they are in the mindset of, looking back and they don't really want to move forward. And that's the fact, that's the thing that's killing them. What do you think about that? If anyone has an opinion, feel free to open your microphone.
I'm just thinking that that's complete ignorance, because I believe that in most cases that people want to be able to move forward and that they're stuck in the past because of a post-traumatic trauma situation, or because they haven't been offered the sort of guidance or counseling that they need.
Yeah. It's like the question, what came before what? Like the egg or tarnegolet, the chicken. So yeah, you can say what came first, the poverty or the fact that they can't move forward. what came first, the fact that they can't get over, they have post-traumatic and depression and a bunch of other stuff. And then even if they do, why doesn't the country help them? So
Or
others blame it
imagine-
on the government, saying the government should show more support, the government should help more, the government should do more. But then the government says, okay, but we have a lot happening. We've got Latet, which you see on the board, that once a year, a week before the Holocaust Memorial Day, has this big fundraiser. But that's not enough, is it? So what has happened in Israel in the past few years, in the past 20 years really, is that people just like me and just like you have been kind of going around and trying to do their best to fit into these different groups, into Holocaust survivor clubs. Now, things you see in the background, this is me with the Holocaust survivor in a club. All my class went to kind of try and get them a little happier before Tu B'Shvat. It's called Amcha, it's in Petah Tikva, and they've got a whole chain of them all over the country. It's a very, very interesting club. They come from all over the place, but mainly Ashkenazi Jews, obviously. And it's, it's sad for me because when I'm there, I see their faces and I know how much they're struggling. And most of them are not in very good shape, obviously, for, they're old and they're experiencing very hard things in their life and they've already gone through a lot. So I wanted to ask you, why do you think the country is not giving as much attention to the people that are the reason the country exists at the end of the day?
I don't know. It's you think if not in Israel, then where, right? Will they get that attention? How could it not be in Israel?
Mm-hmm.
Is it very political in that if the government chooses to give money, that is it other groups that are against that for some reason?
I don't think there's a group against it. But this is a question that I would like to hear your answer of, because I think that you guys know a lot about politics and you've seen the world go through a lot, probably a lot more than I have. And I wanted to ask you if you know an apparent reason for that to happen.
I'm wondering if there's a difference between German Holocaust survivors and those from other countries in Europe. My parents were also Holocaust survivors from Germany. And they got pensions from the German government because they had started to work before they were forced to leave the country. So I'm wondering whether the Israeli government are not expecting that certainly the German Jewish survivors would be getting money from Germany as opposed to from Israel.
That's a very interesting question. And I think that, to be completely honest, it doesn't even matter where you're from. I think that you're just supposed to get the same amount as everyone, and they're supposed to get such higher amounts of what they're getting now. Because even if you look at what Holocaust survivors from Germany get, not to do with their pension, because many of them, the ones that are living now, were children when the war began. They're not getting enough from the country. They're not getting enough in general. They're getting a few €100 a month, which is not enough for, if you know the Israeli prices of living, it's not enough for a supermarket for a month. It's not enough to pay arnona, which is, a bill that you have to pay in Israel. It's not enough to pay the gas and the electricity bill and the water bill. And that's the reason that a lot of them, the statistics show, mainly the ones that are not living with their family and are left alone at this point of their lives, are living in poverty. And it's the reality.
I was just
Can I just say something further to what Claude was saying? The survivors who were working in the ghettos and in the concentration camps and the labor camps were able to apply to the German Claims Conference for a pension for the labor that they provided over during the war. That's what they got like a lump sum depending on what they were able to prove with medical evidence about the impact of their labor on their health status, and then they had a monthly pension. And I think what you said was very instructive. And the problem in Israel and everywhere else, I'm sure, is that the people who are still alive were children, and they have no claim for those monies. Now, I understand there's still money left in that fund, and I think there are people trying to help, spread that money to those in need. Anyone who was a survivor of the Holocaust can apply. Like, even my brother-in-law was born, he's 72 now. He was born in a cemetery in Romania where but it was during the war. His mother had escaped to a cemetery, and he just got he got a small pinch, a small lump sum money. So, I don't know, that maybe there needs to be a little bit more work done in Israel to help people apply to that claims conference fund where there's still money remaining.
I definitely agree.
And I wonder, I wonder what are the politics in Israel that there isn't some coordination from government to these agencies. I don't know.
I'm sure
I
there
think
are.
it's political, and it's
Yeah,
about money, and that the money isn't always, it didn't always fall into the right hands. And, unfortunately, there are people who are suffering as a result because they didn't get and they're not getting what they should be getting. And certainly the government should be supporting them with all of the health and social supports that they need. It's very sad for me to hear that.
definitely. And I agree with you. I agree with all of what you said about how this is probably politic. Now, it's very interesting because this is not something that has changed through the governments. It's always been like this. And each time, again, this is very interesting. The thing that happens in Israel is that around a week before, the Holocaust Memorial Day, suddenly the news is all talking about it, and everyone remembers that they exist, and everyone is trying to get money and funds for them. But then, the Sirens comes on, and people stand, and then it comes off, and the day ends, and people kind of, move on with their lives, because after that, we have the Memorial Day for soldiers and people who were killed in terror attacks, and we have Yom Ha'atzmaut, and life moves on very quickly in Israel. And we kind of forget, and we don't really do too much. And it's very interesting because we know how much these people matter to us. We know how important they are, but we really, really don't give them enough attention. And it's for sure got to do with something political, but I don't know exactly what. So Karen, do you want to say what you wrote out loud? I think it's very interesting.
Sure. In my experience, a lot of older people aren't up to the task of going after the help that they need or the help that they're actually entitled to. They can't navigate the system. They don't have the energy or the ability to connect online, or, even making phone calls places is really hard. You end up pressing buttons and waiting on hold forever. And what if you don't really know who to call? So, people who don't have family or caregivers who can advocate for them and take them places that they need to go to, or help them with paperwork, they're kind of stuck. They're just on their own, and they're not up to it.
Definitely. That's also something that I said about how many of the times they just don't know who to go to. They're just not as connected and not as developed as we are in terms of technology. And, let's say that same club that I went to, if they don't know a person who tells them there's this club going around, no one goes knocking on doors looking for Holocaust survivors, right? Because you just can't. So some of them, for sure, we miss. And things that have happened in Israel, definitely during COVID, is that people have died in their homes and no one knew, no one knew. And no one could be there for them because they had no relatives left. Yeah, Shelley.
I'm picking the wrong thing, my hand.
Oh,
That's okay. It was interesting. We went to Israel for the first time in 2017, and it was part of the UJA trip. And we heard a lot about how UJA supports infrastructure and storot and bomb shelters and community centers. But I can't recall now that we're talking about how much they support survivors in Israel. They support survivors here for sure, but I don't know how much that happens there. But to your other point, I mean, when we stop and commemorate, it's interesting you said, it's like you are commemorating the history, but you're not commemorating those who are still alive, right? In some ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think too, if I may add something, I'm Evelyn. I think too that after the war, Israel was always on a defense mode. Israel did not receive a lot of support from the other countries when after the war, and it was only through the diaspora that are trying to send money through the UJA or other organizations that send money to Israel. And I can remember it from in the last 40 years, there's always every year, UJA is asking money for support to combat something that they're defending Israel from all the forces that comes in. And there's always a war every year. So I guess the funds are always allocated somewhere else, and these people that had suffered the Holocaust are buried in their situation that there's nothing left for them.
Mhm.
And I think that's what's happening. There's no fund. Israel is catching balls as they come. There's always balls dropping down on Israel, and they don't know which one to catch. They're always trying to catch the one that's more important. So these Holocaust people are buried, in the disaster that they were put in.
Definitely.
That's the
So much
unfortunate
happens
part.
that you can't actually reach everyone. So now I want to move on, and I want to tell you about the story that I studied when I was learning literature back in high school, which was not too long ago. This study kind of, left me very uneasy. It's called until all the guard pass. So the story is about a Holocaust survivor. She's a young woman. She's pregnant. And wait, sorry. Oh, Kendra Littman. Yes. Do you want to say anything?
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt if you went on.
Oh, no, definitely. Definitely. I want to hear you.
I was just wondering that when I was living in Israel in 94 to 95, I don't know if things have changed because I don't remember hearing about it in 2000. I was there last. It was almost like there was a shame towards Holocaust victims, almost like the Sabra, the people that were not survivors, had looked at people that were survivors, like the Sabra versus the victim mentality, like the fact that they could even allow themselves to be, it was almost like a shame towards survivors. And I was shocked at that sort of mentality. It was amongst the younger generations, but almost like it was too painful to look at because there was I don't know, a discord between.
So this is that was a really good point because it kind of connects to what the story is about.
Okay.
So this woman, she's a Holocaust survivor, and she is in her last month of pregnancy, and she has PTSD, and she's married her husband that is inviting his friends over for a card game. Now, one of the symptoms is that when she was in the ghetto, they used to have to clap for half an hour, 3 times a day, until all the Nazis' guard passed, and she couldn't stop. So every single day for half an hour, she would clap her hands 3 times a day. Now, just imagine what that does to you and what that does to your life, what it does to your neighbors and the people who are saying, oh, that's the crazy neighbor over there. Yeah, we can't get one night of sleep, okay? So this woman, she's a real woman, and she couldn't get a job anywhere, and she lived for her whole life in poverty because of that same thing. She got no support because she just couldn't stop. So the story moves on, and then they keep playing the cards, and the husband is kind of feeling uneasy because he knows the time for her to start clapping her hands, it's in a certain time every single time. It's like 9 p.m. she will start clapping for half an hour. So he's kind of uneasy because he wants to get them out of his house before she starts clapping, so they won't figure out who it is, because of that same shame that was like going towards people that are Holocaust survivors. And then they hear her and they're like, oh, that's the crazy neighbor. No one knows who she is. No one knows who she lives with. No one knows who she is. If we knew what we have done for her, what we could have done, we could have gotten her kicked out of this place. And it's a really, really harsh story. Now, when I asked my literature teacher, this was a week ago, I asked her to send me it just so I could read over it again. She said, this is the most terrible story. Like, this story brings, like, it gives me chills. Why would you ever want to read it again? And I said, just because of that, because that's the reality. Like, someone in the country went through that. And this wasn't too long ago. This was what, 40 years ago, which is, it really is not too long ago if you think of it. Now this woman, the person that read it, Leaini, she is the child of a Holocaust survivor. And I think that that story really brings a light to the fact that they're not treated as well as they're supposed to be. And many of the times, you know, they're not getting help. And there was a big shame towards them, definitely in the years before, not today, I don't think today, but it was real. So what do you think we can do, you know, living here in Canada? How do you think we can make the situation any better for those people who cannot speak up for themselves, and for those people that we don't usually hear, and for the Holocaust survivors living in Israel, even if you can hear them? If anyone wants to speak up, I'd love that.
Are you asking us how we would solve this problem?
How you think you can help? And yeah, if you were in a position of power, what would you do?
I would try to create family, like match up a survivor with a family that would advocate for them. Kind of like taking in an Israeli student for a year.
Yeah, sounds like someone I know.
Yeah. So because that, you know, it's funny because my siblings and I are talking about it, you know, my mom and dad are getting old, and how are we going to help? And family is everything. And if you have someone to advocate, even if it's not a real family, but an adopted family, that might help. That's where I would start.
Mm-hmm. That's something that they tried to do during COVID. It was this big project. They asked youngsters like me and like people in my class and in my school and in high schools in general, who was interested in having, you know, a relation with a Holocaust survivor, to try and make this time a little less, you know, depressing for them. So they were giving out numbers, and we were supposed to call once a week. I tried my best to keep in contact, but not always were those people interested in having that same contact, because I think, like Ms. Weiss said, not always do they feel comfortable to kind of talk about their problems, and sometimes they don't want to reach out for help, and sometimes they don't know how to, even if they do need help. So it's very interesting. Does anyone else have an opinion on that or anything to say about how we can make anything better?
The stats you were, they know that only 51% are right. They know the numbers, and they must know or get some kind of information census. So I wonder if there would be some kind of way to set up a, you know, active reach out, like you've done, like in calling, but an agency that would take care of that, or solicit families to help out, to reach out to families who are not being connected with.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of similar to Judy's idea, adopting a survivor. And that would be very interesting to do. And that's definitely something that I can pitch when I'm back in Israel. I don't know how to pitch it or to who, but I think that's a very beautiful idea of like having a survivor over. And I hope we can reach people that are not like usually noticed. I think that, like we saw a few slides back, protests are happening in order to make, you know, their living situations better, and in order to make their life more like live in a respectful life for the last few years of your life. And again, this is a situation that's it's kind of hard for me to talk about because I feel very strongly about this. And in my opinion, I don't care about how much money, let's say, like, and I don't, I just think that they should get so much more than they're getting. And I want to leave you with a little bit of food for thought. A lot of money goes in Israel towards, let's say, I don't want to, I'll just say it, ultra Orthodox societies. And I wanted to ask you if you would ever transfer some of that money to Holocaust survivors, or you would ever try to make the situation different by kind of separating the money that goes to different places in the society differently. Let's say maybe give a little more money to the Ethiopian societies in Israel and to the people who are seeking refugee, and to a lot of other groups that need our help and are not receiving it currently. So I really, really want you to think about that. And maybe one day, well, none of you will be politicians in Israel, but maybe in Canada, or kind of advocate for that. So we're done with my plan right now. I know it's a little earlier, but if you have any questions to me or want to share about your life, if you have any relative that is a Holocaust survivor and want to share about their story and how they're living and their experience in this world, then I'd really love to hear that from you. If not, that is also okay. I think, who said, Mary, you have a relative that's a Holocaust survivor, if I'm correct.
My parents were Holocaust survivors from Lodz, Poland, as was the woman who spoke in that little movie. And they're gone. They would be, my mother would be 100 years old today, you know, at this time. And my father was born in 1917. And, you know, they were in Auschwitz and in labor camps. And, you know, they were the lucky ones to survive. And they were the lucky ones who, although they had PTSD, as all Holocaust survivors had it, they had the resilience and the support of that community in Montreal. And they gave us, you know, a happy life, and they had a good life. But, you know, I met many people over the years who struggled and lived with a lot of anger and hatred, and, you know, and they impose that that mentality on their children. And so you have a lot of suffering of the second generation and third generations, you know. So it's a different situation today. You know, we don't want to, you know, how do we educate the young people about keeping the true history alive and separate it from, you know, this mentality of victimhood? You know, it's very difficult. Like, even my sister, who's a little older than me, she says, like, she doesn't want to watch anything for Holocaust Remembrance Week. And it's very hard for us. We should be the ones leading this, but it's very traumatic for us to be immersed in it and in that story. So it's a very complicated reality, and the urgency today is quite severe because of the rise of anti-Semitism, and it's a difficult time.
Definitely.
So anyways, I don't want to be the only one speaking. But you know, Claude also is a child, he says, of Holocaust survivors. So, you know, I don't know, the experience in South Africa, I'm sure there was the variety of experiences all over the world and all the communities. So I don't know.
Claude, if you want to share, that would also be very interesting.
My parents were the lucky ones. They actually escaped before the war, and so they survived pretty well. My grandparents, my mother's parents, got out in 1939, and they came out with a teenage boy. My uncle was a teenager at the time, and they were lucky to be able to find a home in what was then northern Rhodesia. It's now Zambia.
Mm.
The little town that they lived in had 7 Jewish families, all of them Holocaust survivors. And they managed. They started little businesses and they did reasonably well. I think, though, there are organizations that are trying to help the Holocaust survivors who need funds to get them, because as Mary says, there are still funds available in Germany. And I think there's been some negotiation with Poland as well over generating some funds for the Holocaust survivors. So the important thing really is to get the Holocaust survivors in Israel in contact with those organizations that are working on their behalf. I don't know quite how you do that, but I think that's what they should be doing.
And I also will say that Poland is kind of going the other direction. Poland is trying to kind of get away from taking responsibility for what had happened in the war. They
Right.
tried to pass a law saying that no one could say that like the war happened because of the Polish people. It's a very complicated law, and it was very annoying when it was trying to be passed. Yeah, I remember there was this. It was huge in Israel, obviously.
If you look at countries to find out, countries in Europe to find out which ones cared about their Jewish populations and which ones didn't, you just have to look and see what percentage of their Jews they killed or allowed to be killed. And Poland doesn't do so well on that.
No, it does not.
No.
Definitely not. No. So thank you very, very much for joining me. I know that this was a little heavier than the usual ICC, but it is an important subject to talk about. And I'm happy that we had this conversation. I will say that the next one next month is the polar opposite. It's going to be about Israeli comedy. So that'll probably be a little bit more of a fun one to be in. And I invite you all to please sign up and stay with us for the next time. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great night.
I think you're amazing.
I do
You're
too.
quite an educator. You ran an excellent program. You're so intelligent and well spoken, and you were so well prepared. I'm so glad I joined in.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much.
It was amazing.
I agree with Mary.
So do
Yeah.
I.
We all agree.
Yeah. You really know how to open minds.
That's right.
Thank you very much. Have a great night. I was so nervous for this.
Well, you did a great job.
Did a fabulous job.
Amazing job.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Night.
Good night.